With so many local restaurants shutting down because of the pandemic, that has led to a surplus of oysters on Long Island. And now that gesture is helping the environment. Today, environmentalists dropped 50,000 oysters into Oyster Bay Harbor. The town supervisor says the mollusks will help naturally clean and filter local hot waterways.
They dumped millions of oysters into New York's toxic harbor. What scientists found 10 years later left them speechless. The water had been declared dead for nearly a century. Sewage, pollution, total collapse. Then someone made a decision that everyone called crazy. They threw millions of baby oysters into that poisoned wasteland. Experts said it was impossible.
This basket holds probably something in the neighborhood of about 150 market-size oysters.
Got it.
This is kind of like what happens out in the water. We come back along and let's say we want to harvest all of the oysters and get them out of the baskets.
Yeah.
We have yet another piece of equipment that will flip these baskets over, the door opens,
Oh, cool.
and all the oysters fall out.
The city said it was pointless. But 10 years later, divers went down to check the reefs. What they pulled up from the bottom changed everything we thought we knew about dead water. Imagine standing at the edge of Manhattan today, looking out across the harbor. The water laps against concrete piers, ferries churn past, and the Statue of Liberty stands watch over one of the busiest ports in the world. It's hard to picture, but beneath these same waters, centuries ago, lay an entirely different landscape, one built not by human hands, but by millions upon millions of oysters. Before the first skyscraper rose, before the subway, tunnels burrowed beneath the streets, New York Harbor was home to something extraordinary. Oyster reefs stretched across more than 200,000 acres of the seabed. To put that in perspective, that's an area larger than the entire city of Chicago. These weren't just scattered clusters of shellfish. They were massive underwater structures, some rising so close to the surface that Dutch sailors in the 1600s had to steer carefully around them to avoid running their ships aground. For the indigenous Lenape people who lived along these shores long before European contact, the oyster beds were woven into the fabric of daily existence. Archaeological sites scattered across the islands and coastline still tell this story today. Dig almost anywhere near the old waterfront, and you'll find layers of oyster shells stacked deep in the soil. These aren't random deposits. They're middens, the remains of countless meals shared over generations. The Lenape harvested oysters, seasonally, taking what they needed and allowing the beds to replenish naturally. The shells themselves had value beyond food. They were used in tools, in trade, and in ceremonies that marked the rhythm of the year. When European settlers arrived and began to establish what would become New York City, they quickly recognized the abundance at their feet, or rather, just offshore. Oysters became more than sustenance. They became the city's calling card. By the early 1800s, you couldn't walk through Lower Manhattan without encountering them. Street vendors set up carts on nearly every corner, selling oysters by the dozen to anyone with a few coins. They were remarkably cheap, which meant everyone ate them. Dock workers grabbing a quick meal between shifts, businessmen stopping at tavern bars, families gathering for weekend dinners. Oysters were democratic in a way few foods were. They fed the poor and graced the tables of the wealthy with equal enthusiasm. The scale of this industry is difficult to comprehend from our modern perspective. Historical shipping records from the late 1800s show that New York was sending out millions of oysters every single week. Rail cars packed with ice and shellfish rolled west to cities across the growing nation. Barges loaded with oysters floated up the Hudson River. The harvest was so prolific that New York earned a nickname that stuck for decades, the oyster capital of the world. This wasn't marketing exaggeration, it was a simple fact. No other city came close to matching New York's output. The reefs themselves shaped the physical geography of the harbor. They stretched from the Battery at the southern tip of Manhattan all the way out to the far reaches of the estuary. These living structures didn't just sit passively on the bottom, they actively changed the environment around them. Oyster reefs are natural water filters. A single adult oyster can process up to 50 gallons of water in a single day, straining out sediment, algae, and organic particles. Multiply that by millions of oysters across thousands of acres, and you begin to understand the scale of their impact. The harbor water, despite all the ships and activity, remained remarkably clear. Beyond filtration, the reefs created habitat. Their complex three-dimensional structure provided shelter and feeding grounds for an entire web of marine life. Fish spawned among the shells, crabs scuttled through the crevices, birds dove to pluck prey from the shallows. The reefs broke up wave action during storms, dissipating energy that would otherwise pound the shoreline. In a very real sense, these oyster beds protected the growing city, acting as a natural buffer against the sea. The shells themselves became building material. Early New Yorkers discovered that crushed oyster shells made excellent mortar. Walk through the oldest parts of the city today, and you're looking at buildings held together, in part, by the same reefs that once lined the harbor. Even more directly, discarded shells were used as landfill. As the city expanded, developers pushed the shoreline outward, dumping tons of shell waste to create new ground. Entire neighborhoods rose on foundations made from what the harbor had provided. Pearl Street, one of Manhattan's oldest thoroughfares, takes its name from the mother of pearl that once littered the shore. People at the time understood, at least dimly, that this resource wasn't infinite. As early as 1715, colonial authorities passed laws attempting to protect the oyster beds. Harvesting during spawning season was banned, at least on paper. The idea was to give the oysters a chance to reproduce before they were raked from the bottom. But enforcement was spotty at best, and the city's appetite only grew stronger as the population exploded. By the mid-1800s, the markets hummed with constant trade. On any given morning, you could watch barges loaded with oysters drift up the East River, their cargo destined for the Fulton Fish Market or one of the many dealers scattered across the waterfront. Fishermen didn't measure their catch in dozens or even hundreds. They measured in tons. Oysters had become currency in their own right, a commodity as reliable as grain or timber. This golden age seemed permanent to those living through it. The reefs had always been there, and surely they always would be. Restaurants built their reputations on oyster dishes. Shucking houses employed hundreds of workers who spent their days prying open shells and preparing meat for sale. The whole enterprise felt as solid and unchanging as the bedrock beneath the city. Yet there were signs, ignored or dismissed, that the system was beginning to strain. The beds closest to the city were the first to decline. Harvesters had to venture further out into the harbor to find productive reefs. The largest oysters, the ones that had been growing for years, became increasingly rare. The easiest pickings were gone, scraped away by decades of intensive raking and dredging. Still, the industry pressed on. There seemed no reason to worry. The harbor was vast, the reefs extensive, and New York's faith in its own abundance remained unshaken. Oysters were as much a part of the city's identity as the harbor itself, inseparable from what it meant to be a New Yorker in those years. The shells that had built the shoreline, fed generations, and shaped the very layout of the streets seemed destined to continue doing so indefinitely. It was a way of life built on the back of an ecosystem that had thrived for thousands of years, and no one seriously imagined it could end. The turn of the 20th century brought with it a darker chapter in the harbor's story. The same industrial growth that made New York a global powerhouse began to exact a devastating toll on the waters surrounding it. The oyster beds that had seemed limitless were about to face pressures unlike anything they had endured before. Harvesting had always been intensive, but by the early 1900s, it had become relentless. New technology made it easier to rake the beds flat, stripping away not just the mature oysters, but the entire structure of the reefs themselves. Traditional harvesting methods had at least left some of the reef structure intact, allowing young oysters to settle and grow on the shells of their predecessors. But now, steam-powered dredges could scrape the bottom clean, hauling up millions of oysters each week and leaving behind only mud and sand. Without that hard substrate, baby oysters had nowhere to attach. The reefs that had taken centuries to build were being dismantled in a matter of decades. Yet over-harvesting, destructive as it was, turned out to be only part of the problem. The real catastrophe was unfolding above the waterline, in the city itself. New York's population had exploded. In 1850, roughly 500,000 people called the city home. By 1900, that number had surged past 3 million. Every one of those people produced waste, and almost none of it was being treated before it entered the water. The harbor became the city's dumping ground. Raw sewage flowed directly from pipes into the estuary. Factories discharged chemical waste without restriction. Slaughterhouses, tanneries, and manufacturing plants all contributed their own toxic mix. The same tidal currents that had once carried oyster larvae to new reefs now delivered waves of pollution. Storm drains and sewer lines were often combined into a single system, which meant that every heavy rainfall sent a surge of untreated waste straight into the harbor. The impact on water quality was catastrophic. The harbor, once clear enough to see the bottom in many places, turned murky and dark. Oxygen levels plummeted as bacteria consumed organic waste, creating dead zones where almost nothing could survive. The oysters, fixed in place on the seabed, had no way to escape. They filtered the water as they always had, but now that water was laced with pathogens, heavy metals, and industrial chemicals. Disease swept through the remaining beds. Oysters that managed to survive the pollution often carried bacteria dangerous to humans. Cases of typhoid fever and other waterborne illnesses were traced back to oysters harvested from the harbor. Public health officials began to sound alarms. By the early 1920s, it was clear that eating oysters from New York Harbor had become a serious health risk. In 1927, the city took drastic action. Health authorities shut down the last commercial oyster beds in the harbor, declaring the shellfish unsafe for human consumption. It happened quickly, almost overnight. An industry that had defined the city for 2 centuries simply vanished. The oystermen, the shucking houses, the dealers and vendors all found themselves without a livelihood. The beds were closed, and they would remain closed for decades to come. The consequences rippled far beyond economics. Without oysters to filter the water, the harbor's ecological collapse accelerated. Sediment that would have been captured by the reefs remained suspended in the water column, blocking sunlight and smothering what little marine life remained. Algae blooms became common, fed by the nutrients in sewage and agricultural runoff. When the algae died and decomposed, it consumed even more oxygen, creating a vicious cycle of degradation. Fish populations crashed. Species that had once thrived in the harbor either disappeared entirely or retreated to cleaner waters. Birds that had fed on the abundant marine life found less and less to sustain them. The complex web of life that the oyster reefs had supported for millennia began to unravel. What had been one of the most productive estuaries on the East Coast became known as one of the most polluted. For most New Yorkers, the harbor simply became part of the urban background, something to be ignored rather than celebrated. The water smelled bad, looked worse, and was widely understood to be toxic. City planners focused their attention elsewhere. There were bridges to build, neighborhoods to develop, an entire metropolis to manage. The idea that the harbor could be anything other than an industrial wasteland seemed absurd. It was easier to write it off as the price of progress. This perception persisted for decades. By mid-century, the harbor's decline had become a cautionary tale, cited by environmentalists and scientists studying ecosystem collapse. Here was proof, they argued, that even the richest and most abundant natural resource could be destroyed by human activity. The oyster beds that had fed a city and shaped its development were gone, reduced to a historical footnote. Most people under the age of 50 had never seen a healthy oyster reef and had no memory of what the harbor had once been. But even as the water grew darker and the ecosystem deteriorated, a few things were quietly changing. The worst excesses of industrial pollution began to draw attention. Scientists started documenting just how degraded the harbor had become, compiling data on dissolved oxygen, bacterial counts, and chemical contamination. Environmental activists, emboldened by the growing awareness of pollution nationwide, began to push for reform. The turning point came in 1972, when Congress passed the Clean Water Act. This landmark legislation fundamentally changed how the United States approached water pollution. For the first time, dumping untreated sewage and industrial waste into navigable waters became illegal under federal law. Cities and factories were required to treat their discharge, and regulators were given the tools to enforce compliance. For New York, this meant a massive and expensive undertaking. The city's infrastructure dated back generations, with sewer lines and treatment systems that were woefully inadequate for a population of millions. Upgrading these systems would take billions of dollars and decades of construction. Wastewater treatment plants had to be built or expanded. Combined sewer overflows, the pipes that still dumped raw sewage during heavy rains, would need to be addressed. It was a daunting task, and progress came slowly. Yet progress did come. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, water quality in the harbor began to improve, bit by bit. Bacterial counts dropped, dissolved oxygen levels rose, fish that hadn't been seen in years started to reappear. Harbor seals, once driven away by pollution, began returning to the waters around the city. These were small signs, easily overlooked, but they were real. Marine biologists conducting surveys in the harbor began finding something unexpected. On old pilings, on rock jetties, on the submerged remains of abandoned piers, a few wild oysters clung to survival. Not many, and not thriving, but they were there. These survivors had somehow endured a century of pollution, overharvesting, and habitat destruction. Their presence suggested something remarkable, that even after near total collapse, the harbor hadn't completely died. For the first time in generations, restoration didn't seem like pure fantasy. The Clean Water Act had provided a legal framework for recovery. The infrastructure investments, slow as they were, had begun to show results. And those few wild oysters proved that the harbor could still support shellfish, at least in limited numbers. The question was no longer whether the harbor could support life. The water quality, while far from pristine, had improved enough to make the question worth asking. What remained to be seen was whether anyone would actually try to bring the oysters back. The reefs were gone, the ecological memory erased, and most New Yorkers had no idea their harbor had ever been different. But the door, sealed shut for so long, had cracked open just slightly. The city's great estuary had been given a second chance, whether anyone was ready to take it or not. In 2014, a small group of students gathered on Governor's Island, staring at a problem that would have seemed absurd to most New Yorkers. Before them sat piles of empty oyster shells, hundreds of pounds of what restaurants across the city considered garbage. Their task was to turn this waste into the foundation of something the harbor hadn't seen in nearly a century: living oyster reefs. The project had been conceived by Pete Malinowski and Murray Fisher, two educators who saw potential where others saw only pollution and bureaucratic obstacles. They called it the Billion Oyster Project, and the name wasn't metaphorical. Their genuine aim was to restore 1 billion oysters to New York Harbor, rebuilding the ecosystem one recycled shell at a time. To most observers, it sounded impossibly ambitious, perhaps even foolish. The harbor was still polluted, still subject to sewage overflows, and oyster restoration remained heavily regulated precisely because of these ongoing problems. But Malinowski and Fisher had a plan that started with the most basic resource: shells. Oyster larvae need hard surfaces to settle on, and nothing works better than the shells of adult oysters. In nature, reefs build themselves over time as new generations settle on the shells of their predecessors. But with no reefs left in the harbor, that natural process had nowhere to start. The solution was to collect shells from the city's restaurants, clean them, and use them as settlement substrate for hatchery-raised larvae. The logistics were straightforward but labor-intensive. Students and volunteers fanned out across Manhattan and Brooklyn, visiting restaurants and collecting buckets of discarded shells. What would have gone to landfills instead made its way to Governor's Island, where the shells were spread across open-air curing yards. There they sat for months, exposed to sun, rain, and weather. This wasn't just storage. The curing process was essential. Sunlight and rainfall gradually broke down any lingering organic matter, scrubbing away food residue and bacteria until the shells were clean enough to go back into the water. By the end of that first year, the project had accumulated over 100,000 pounds of shells. To put that in perspective, that's roughly the weight of 45 compact cars, all stacked in piles around the island. It was a tangible sign that the city's restaurant industry produced enough shell waste to actually make a difference, if someone was willing to do the work of collecting it. But shells alone weren't enough. The next step required turning those shells into living reefs, and that meant working with oyster larvae. At the Harbor School's hatchery, students learned the delicate science of breeding and raising oyster spat. These are the microscopic larvae that drift through the water column in their first days of life, searching for a place to settle. In the hatchery, conditions could be controlled. Temperature, salinity, and food supply were all monitored carefully to give the larvae the best possible chance of survival. Once the spat was large enough, they were introduced to the cured shells. The larvae settled in clusters, cementing themselves to the surface with a natural adhesive. Each shell could host dozens of tiny oysters, and each batch was meticulously counted, tagged, and tracked. Students kept detailed logs of every step in the process. They recorded water temperatures, survival rates, and growth patterns. Some days meant wading into frigid harbor water to check underwater cages. Other days were spent troubleshooting equipment failures in the makeshift laboratory, fixing pumps and filters that kept the hatchery running. The work was unglamorous and repetitive: hauling shells, seeding larvae, checking cages, recording data. But every shell that went back into the water represented a small vote of confidence in the harbor's ability to recover. The students weren't just learning marine biology, they were actively participating in an experiment that most adults had written off as impossible. They also had to navigate a thicket of regulations. 4 years earlier, New Jersey had banned oyster restoration in polluted waters after people were caught illegally harvesting oysters from closed areas. The incident had made officials on both sides of the harbor deeply cautious about any restoration project. In New York, every reef site required a stack of permits. The rules were unambiguous: no harvesting under any circumstances, constant monitoring to ensure compliance, and complete transparency about where oysters were being placed. To address these concerns, the project installed underwater cameras at restoration sites. Cages holding young oysters were tagged with tracking devices. Signs were posted warning that these oysters were part of a restoration project and were not safe to eat. Even with all these precautions, some city officials remained skeptical. They viewed the effort as well-intentioned but ultimately symbolic, more of a school science project than a serious solution to the harbor's problems. The skepticism didn't stop the work. Harbor school crews developed efficient systems for moving shells from curing yards to barges, then out to deployment sites around the harbor. Each new reef presented its own set of challenges. Tides had to be timed carefully. Boat traffic in one of the world's busiest ports had to be navigated. Structures had to be anchored securely in currents that could shift unpredictably with weather and season. The deployment sites themselves were chosen strategically. Some were along piers and breakwaters where the water was relatively sheltered. Others were in more exposed locations, testing whether oysters could survive in higher energy environments. The team used different types of structures as well. Some reefs were built using gabions, wire cages filled with shells that created stable three-dimensional habitat. Others used reef balls, concrete domes with holes that allowed water to flow through while providing attachment points for oysters. Storm damage was a constant concern. More than once, equipment was washed away or damaged by rough weather. There were batches of spat that failed to attach properly, victims of water temperature swings or unexpected changes in salinity. Each setback required the team to adapt. They adjusted deployment techniques, modified cage designs, and learned to work with the harbor's rhythms rather than against them. By the end of 2015, the Billion Oyster Project had successfully seeded millions of oysters across multiple sites in the harbor. The reefs were still small, still vulnerable, and still unproven in the long term. Critics remained vocal. The water quality issues hadn't been solved. Combined sewer overflows continued to dump untreated waste after heavy rains. Disease remained a threat. And the sheer scale of what would be needed to truly restore the harbor, not just a few scattered reefs, but the hundreds of thousands of acres that had once existed, seemed almost incomprehensible. Yet something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in living memory, people were actively trying to rebuild what had been lost. They weren't just studying the problem or documenting the decline, they were getting their hands dirty, literally, hauling shells and building reefs. The students who participated came away with a tangible sense that they had contributed to something meaningful. They had taken restaurant waste and turned it into habitat. They had raised oysters from microscopic larvae to thumb-sized juveniles and placed them back in the wild. The foundation was being laid, shell by shell, reef by reef. The city's experiment in ecological restoration had moved beyond planning and into action. Whether it would succeed remained an open question, but at least now there was something concrete to measure, something real growing beneath the surface. The harbor hadn't been rebuilt yet, but the work of rebuilding had undeniably begun. At Hudson River Park, the first tangible results of the restoration effort began to emerge from beneath the surface. Scientists and volunteers worked together to lower structures into the water, carefully placing reef balls and wire gabions that had been seeded with millions of hatchery-raised oyster spat. These weren't natural reefs in the traditional sense, but they were designed to mimic the complex structure that wild reefs would have provided, creating nooks and crannies where marine life could shelter and feed. Within 3 years, the results exceeded even optimistic projections. Survey teams conducting regular counts tallied more than 35 million spat that had successfully settled across the Hudson River Park site. That number alone represented a dramatic shift from the near-barren conditions that had existed just a few years earlier. But raw numbers only told part of the story. What mattered just as much was what else had arrived. Divers and students monitoring the reefs started documenting an expanding cast of characters. Blue crabs picked their way through the shells. Oyster toadfish, peculiar bottom-dwelling creatures that had been rare in the harbor, took up residence in the crevices. Mud snails crawled across the surfaces. Tiny grass shrimp darted between the structures. By the 3rd year of monitoring, careful species counts revealed measurable differences between different reef designs. The gabion cages hosted 37 different species, while the reef balls nearby supported 32. These weren't enormous differences, but they were statistically significant. The restored reefs were creating biodiversity that simply hadn't existed in these locations before. Further up the river at Tappan Zee, something even more surprising was unfolding. Here, the project team had tried a different approach. Instead of seeding shells with hatchery-raised spat, they deployed bare substrate, just clean shell and rock, to see what would happen naturally. It was a calculated risk. The assumption for years had been that New York's waters were too degraded, too unpredictable for wild oyster larvae to find and settle on new habitat without human intervention. The results challenged that assumption completely. Over the next few seasons, wild oyster larvae discovered the new substrate on their own. By the time the team finished their comprehensive counts, they had documented 5.8 million wild oysters that had settled naturally on the site. These weren't oysters that anyone had raised in a hatchery or carefully placed. They were the offspring of the few wild survivors that had persisted in the river, now finding suitable habitat for the first time in generations. Marine biologists following the project called it a genuine turning point. The spontaneous settlement demonstrated something crucial. The harbor's wild oyster population, though severely diminished, hadn't been completely eliminated. Given the right conditions, primarily clean substrate in relatively decent water, the oysters could begin to recover on their own. The restoration wasn't just adding oysters to the system, it was jump-starting natural processes that had been interrupted for nearly a century. Volunteer monitors played an essential role in documenting these changes. Armed with clipboards, waterproof cameras, and identification guides, they logged every creature they spotted during their surveys. Each shell was counted, each species was recorded. Every new patch of successful settlement was mapped and photographed. Their data, cross-checked and verified by professional marine biologists, built an increasingly robust case that the restoration was accomplishing more than just putting oysters back in the water. It was rebuilding the foundation of a functioning marine ecosystem. The numbers continued to climb year after year. More species appeared, more spat settled, more evidence accumulated that the harbor could once again support complex marine communities. Students who had started the monitoring work as skeptics found themselves measuring fish and crabs that hadn't been documented in these waters for decades. The changes weren't dramatic in the way that a wilderness recovery might be, with large charismatic animals returning to an area. Instead, it was an accumulation of small creatures, invertebrates, and small fish mostly, but their presence represented something profound. By 2024, the scale of the restoration had grown substantially. Across New York Harbor, more than 130 million live oysters now anchored nearly 19 acres of restored reef. To visualize that, imagine 14 football fields covered end-to-end with oyster habitat. The project had also diverted over 2 million pounds of discarded restaurant shells from the city's waste stream, transforming material that would have gone to landfills into the structural foundation for new marine life. Project coordinators maintained meticulous records of every aspect of the operation. Each truckload of shells was weighed and documented. Every batch of spat raised in the hatchery was counted and tracked. The reefs themselves were mapped with GPS precision, allowing researchers to monitor specific locations over time and compare outcomes between different sites and deployment methods. These restored reefs were functioning as living structures. The oysters filtered water continuously, each one processing dozens of gallons per day. They provided three-dimensional habitat that didn't exist in the muddy bottom that dominates much of the harbor. They created substrate where algae could grow, which in turn fed grazers, which fed larger predators, building up the food web from the bottom. In places where the harbor had seemed ecologically empty, dense clusters of oysters now stacked along the artificial structures, their shells layering thick from years of growth and new settlement. Yet the work remained far from complete, and significant challenges persisted. Disease continued to threaten the reefs. Pathogens like dermo and MSX, common along the entire east coast, could devastate an oyster population in a single summer. These diseases had always existed, but stressed oysters in marginal conditions were particularly vulnerable. Marine pathologists at local laboratories maintained constant surveillance, testing samples for early signs of infection and working with hatchery managers to select disease-resistant broodstock. Environmental conditions posed their own risks. Recent years had brought dock failures and heat waves that triggered mass die-offs at some restoration sites. Engineers responded by redesigning deployment structures, creating modular cages that could be moved if conditions deteriorated. They also began placing oysters deeper in stum, the water column, hoping to buffer them from the temperature swings and freshwater pulses that occurred during heavy rainfall. Water quality, despite decades of improvement, remained problematic. Combined sewer overflows continued to dump untreated sewage into the harbor after major storms. These overflows were a consequence of the city's aging infrastructure, where storm drains and sanitary sewers shared the same pipes. During heavy rain, the system's capacity was exceeded, and the excess went straight into the water. This ongoing pollution was why health officials maintained strict rules prohibiting any harvesting from the harbor. No matter how many oysters were restored, whether 100 million juveniles per year or even 1 billion by 2035, they couldn't be eaten until the sewage problem was definitively solved. The city had committed $45 billion to upgrading its wastewater infrastructure, a massive investment that would take decades to fully implement. The restored oyster reefs could complement these efforts, helping to filter water and improve conditions at the margins, but they couldn't replace proper sewage treatment. Restoration advocates were careful to emphasize this point. The oysters weren't a silver bullet solution to the harbor's problems. They were one piece of a much larger puzzle. There were positive developments beyond just oyster numbers. Wave attenuation measurements showed that restored reefs were helping to stabilize marsh edges in some locations. The structures broke up wave energy during storms, reducing erosion along vulnerable shorelines. This protective function had been one of the original ecological roles of oyster reefs, and its return suggested that the restoration was beginning to provide actual ecosystem services to the city. As monitoring continued, not all the data had been published or peer-reviewed. Long-term studies take time to complete, and the full impact of the restoration on harbor-wide water quality remained under active investigation. Scientists were cautious about making sweeping claims. The evidence clearly showed that oysters were surviving, reproducing in some locations, and supporting increased biodiversity at restoration sites. Whether this translated to measurable improvements in overall water quality across the entire harbor was a more complex question that required years of additional data collection. What the evidence did confirm was that oysters could help cities adapt to environmental challenges and begin to recover lost habitat. The restoration wasn't reversing climate change or eliminating pollution, but it was creating resilient marine habitat in an urban environment that desperately needed it. New York's story demonstrated that even after ecological collapse so complete that an entire industry vanished and an ecosystem was written off as dead, persistent effort combined with science-based action could rebuild what had seemed permanently lost. The work continued, driven by the understanding that restoration is measured in decades, not years, and that every shell placed, every spat raised, and every reef monitored represented one more step toward a harbor that could once again sustain the life it had lost.